So we are in the series in the book of Ezekiel, and this is part 3 of our 4-part series. So to me, the heart of the book of Ezekiel is a message of restoration, right? And I believe this message of restoration needs to be talked about because we live in a broken and fallen world. And many times we get caught up in that brokenness and that sin, and we identify with that. And we identify with that sin and we lose our identity in Christ. So we're made in the image of God, but sometimes we lose sight of how we were created. And we also lose sight of who we were created by. And we lose sight on who God really is. So when we kicked this series off, we looked at Ezekiel and the call on his life and the vision of God that struck him with awe and wonder. And it wasn't just that grand vision, but there was also a grand message attached to that call. And God called Ezekiel to show the Israelites how much they were sinning and what the consequences of that sin was going to be. God told Ezekiel that it wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be very, very difficult. But even if the message fell on deaf ears, then Ezekiel still needed to let them know who God was. And it wasn't just Ezekiel that God was raising up at this time to try to get the Jewish people's attention. He was sending prophet after prophet to the Israelites to speak a message after message, to turn away from your sin and repent. But the Israelites had a heart problem. They turned away from God. They were replacing them with idols in the temple. They were following the world and following all the influence around it. I would even go as far as say maybe they had a little bit of spiritual pride as well. You know, I think they believed they took comfort in the fact that they were descendants of Abraham, and God made that promise to Abraham that he was going to have that land. His descendants were going to possess it. And I'm sure that there was a little bit of arrogance and cockiness with that nothing's going to happen to them. It's kind of like today when we get a little bit of spiritual pride, right? We have the concept that, you know, just because once upon a time we prayed a sinner's prayer, or our family goes to church, or once upon a time we were baptized, we have the license to live however we want, including a life of sin. And somehow, some way, we're safe from those decisions. But it doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't work that way. Israel had a heart problem. They were deceived. They lost their identity and they were full of self. But God still tried to reach them exactly where they were at. We talked about that in week 1, that God sent the prophets and sent Ezekiel because he has persistent love for his creation. You know, no matter how far we run, he's always right there waiting for us to turn back to him with open arms. But Israel was rebellious and stubborn, but they weren't ignorant. They knew who God was, and they chose to live that life without him, and were refusing to change their mind no matter what, refusing to change their heart. In week 2, we said God is the God of love, but he's also a God of justice. We said that love has to be a choice because captivity, forcing, or taking that decision away from somebody, that's not love. So God gave us that opportunity to choose him in our lives. But if we push him away, he's going to honor that choice too. He's still going to be there waiting for us and trying to get our attention the whole time, trying to get us to turn back, trying not to get us to pick that wrong choice. But overall, he's going to honor our choice even if it's the wrong one. We talked about examples and warnings like Noah's Ark, and it would have stood as this giant billboard for 75 to 100 years while it was being built, a warning against wickedness and the corruption of the world. A warning of judgment was on the horizon, and a warning that was ignored until that rain started to fall and those floodwaters started to open up. Last week we talked about Ezekiel and his warnings to the Jewish people about Babylon coming and being God's instrument to bring judgment on the people, and warnings about the siege of their city of Jerusalem and the horrors that they're going to endure. You know, we talked about Ezekiel laying on his side for over a year to show the weight of the sin of the people. We talked about his starvation diet of cow dung smoked out. So we talked about the shock of Ezekiel cutting his hair off, and even more shocking, using it to prophesy what was going to happen to the people. You know, the third were going to be lost to famine and plague during the siege. A third was going to fall into an invasion. A third was going to get scattered to the wind. But a couple strands were going to get tucked into his pocket. Couple people, couple strands, because there were still people looking up to God even when everything else fell away. But the majority of those people, though, their hearts were so hard and in such denial that God had to hold that mirror up to them in a very dynamic fashion. We talked about Ezekiel's wife passing away and him not being able to mourn or shed a tear. And it was an act that completely disconnected from the reality of the situation, because that's how the people were when God's temple was being destroyed and burned down to the ground. Aaron put it in a perfect way. He said it was spiritual shell shock. They should be mourning and weeping, but there was such a disconnect because they were so deep in their sin. That's a very broken and lost place to be. And we get into that very broken and lost place ourselves too, right? We can push God out of our lives just the same as the people of Jerusalem. We can replace God with idols in our life so easily. We can make God a low priority and make that mistake to elevate everything else above him. We think we can solve it. We're enough, and we have it under control. And then we get shocked when it falls apart. Maybe we cry, maybe we rage, maybe we mourn, maybe we're just numb and can't feel anything, just like the people of Jerusalem. But even during this dark time in Jewish history, there was a promise of restoration. There was a promise of hope and a future. And in order to start that, they needed to find their identity in God once again with it. They had to look at that dirty reflection in the mirror, recognizing the sin and the shortfalls in their life, and admit they're not enough and they need God to help them. And if you want to have restoration in your life, then you need to be honest about what's broken. And then you turn it over to God. And then you recognize who he is. You know, sometimes when we're faced with a challenge, we pray. And we talk to God. And we tell him all about the mountains that we're facing in our life. But sometimes what we need to do is start looking at those mountains that we're facing in our life and start telling them all about our God and who he is. Our God has the strength. Our God has the power, the might, and the authority over them. And we have the faith that our God can move those mountains in our life and tell them to move because our God reigns. Our God reigns. He reigns sovereign. He has supreme power and authority. He is the creator of heaven and earth, and there is nothing too big for him and nothing too small for him to notice. And he has that power and authority over all creation. We saw that in his son Jesus when he walked the earth. He was all God and all man. And we saw that God part on display readily. Jesus had the power and authority over sickness. He would heal people from their diseases. He would touch and cure people that were plagued by leprosy. Jesus would restore sight to the blind and heal the paraplegic. Jesus had the power and authority over nature when he would stop a storm with just the word of his mouth. When he had to feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and everyone was full and satisfied, and there's 12 baskets left over. That's not math. That works in the natural. Jesus had the power and authority over demons. They trembled and they begged in just his presence. And Jesus only had to speak for them to be driven out and go away. Jesus had the power and authority over death. He raised people from the dead on a couple of occasions. And of course, God raised Jesus from the dead 3 days after crucifixion for our sins. And in all these examples, we see God's supreme sovereignty, his authority over everything. And in Ezekiel, God is showing that sovereignty as well in a different way. So through our study, we know God gives warnings to the Jewish people about upcoming judgment of the nations. But what about the rest of the world? God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was the God of Israel. He was the God who promised Messiah through Israel's great King David, which is all well and good involving this little country, this little speck on the map, right? But what about the rest of the world? Ezekiel's chapter 25 through 32 takes God's warnings and judgment beyond the walls of Jerusalem, beyond the borders of Judah and Israel, and beyond the Jewish people. God gives Ezekiel an oracle of judgment against 7 surrounding nations, including a superpower, just to show God's sovereignty, that he isn't just the God of Israel, but he's the God over all creation. These nations that God judges are nations that have a history with the Jewish people. Some of the ones partake either directly or indirectly in Jerusalem's downfall, and others just celebrate it because they felt like they can gain from Jerusalem's fall. In each case, God held the mirror up to these nations and their sins, and they needed to know who he was. So I brought a map. Did you upload the map onto there?
A map?
Yeah, never mind. We don't have a map. Yeah, I put it as a link on there, but that's okay. But the nations are Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistine, Tyre, Sidon, and also Egypt. So we're going to start with the nation of Ammon. In Ezekiel 25, 6 through 7. Someone want to read?
For this is what the sovereign Lord says.
Because you have clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel. Therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. I will wipe you out from among the nations and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord.
So this was Ammon, the Ammonites, and they trace back to Genesis. Anybody know who Lot was?
Someone's nephew, right?
Abraham's nephew. Very, very good. So he traveled with Abraham to the promised land. They had a dispute over pasture land, and they ended up parting ways. And Lot ended up taking his family to this lovely place called Sodom. So, and later in Genesis, we see about the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah. Those towns were so corrupt that God sent angels to destroy the towns. But he spared Lot and his family, for the most part. So Lot's wife, she had an act of disobedience, and she looked at the burning towns, and she turned into a pillar of salt. And that destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was the beginning and middle of Genesis chapter 19. So yeah, these are the nations that were surrounding the kingdom of Israel from the north, and the kingdom of Judah, which were the Jewish people to the south. But Lot and his wife were all in chapter 19, but at the end of chapter 19, we see the consequences for Lot and raising his family in such a corrupt environment. Because a corrupt environment like Sodom and Gomorrah has an influence on you. And when you put your fellowship with people that have a low moral code or no moral code, it's going to make an imprint on you as well. And in this case, we see Lot and his two daughters escape from Sodom, and they go up and they live in the mountains. But after a while, his daughters start talking and they start worrying about having children. So they came up with a plan. They were going to get their father drunk, let him pass out, and lay with him. And that shows you that you can take the family out of a corrupt place like Sodom, but you can't take a corrupt place like Sodom out of the family. Their twisted plan worked. Genesis 19, 36 through 38. Anyone?
So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami is the father of the Mennonites of today.
Good stuff. So this was,
What?
yeah, a corrupt place like Sodom, man. This is what comes from the family with it. So,
Just to be clear, the daughters had sex with their dad.
yes,
And they got pregnant.
yes.
They both got pregnant,
Did
they
they-
both had sons, and both of the sons,
Ended up forming these nations.
I
Their
thought you were going to say
ancestors.
ended up deformed.
No. They ended up forming these nations that God ends up judging later
I
onto.
really researched this. I mean, because it's quite disturbing how incest there is in like in the beginning of the Bible.
Yeah.
And,
well, we started out with Adam and Eve, so.
well, right.
Yeah.
Well, in
Yeah.
a sense, like basically, people didn't come out like messed up because the gene pool was closer to perfection. Now we're all screwed up. But like
Yes.
back then, the gene pool started off perfect, so then the babies weren't like
Oh.
necessarily
And that
messed up.
sin corrupts
That doesn't
through
make
the
it
generations.
cool.
Yeah, no, you're
Well,
exactly right. No.
They turned out alright, I
I
guess.
still don't know that I would have sex with my dad if I knew my kid would have all of his fingers.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Not
But I think if you lived in a place like Sodom, that would have been like,
It was more normal back
yeah,
then.
they wouldn't have kicked. Like, Sodom was a very corrupt
Apparently,
place.
so is cooking your
So.
food over cow dung.
Right?
They don't do that
All you guys gotta say is thanks, Mike, for taking us through the Old Testament. This
Yeah.
is awesome.
either.
So,
Wonderful.
Not
but,
that it's okay today, but
yeah.
it was a little, or even at
It
this
wasn't
point,
okay back then, to
This
be honest with
wasn't
you, in this
okay either,
situation.
but it was
So,
more common.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can see the origin of two of the seven nations that God judges right here, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And both of them were very distant relatives to the Jewish people. The Jewish people came from Abraham, the Moabites, and Ammonites came from his nephew Lot. And the Ammonites had a long and bloody history with the Jewish people. In Exodus, we see the Israelites fighting with them for territory. They create alliances with Israel's enemies and fought during Judges. They went to war and they were defeated by King Saul and later by King David. But there was also times of peace too. And at one point, the Ammonites promised to join with the Jewish people against Babylon. And the Ammonites later backed out of that alliance and took advantage of Jerusalem's downfall by plundering and grabbing territories. And that didn't last long because Babylon eventually set their sights on Ammon and they destroyed it. And Ammon was done after that. That country never again recovered from that. They took pleasure and profits in Israel's destruction, and they paid the price for it. And Moabites, they were in the same boat. Ezekiel 25, 10 and 11 says, I will give you Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession, so that the Ammonites will not be remembered among the nations. And I will inflict punishment on Moab, and they will know that I am the Lord. And again, it's the same story with the Moabs. There was times of war, times of peace with Israel's neighbors. And Moab did also join in celebrating, plundering, and grabbing territories after Babylon took Jerusalem. And they met with the same fate as their cousins. The sons of the east, aka Babylon, came and wiped out Moab shortly after Jerusalem's fall too. There's also the nation, can you bring up that map one more time? Of Edom, which is the one that is to the south.
You need a pointer.
Yeah.
The big yellow one.
Of Edom, the yellow one. Yeah. So they also had some ancestral roots with Jewish people as well. And if you look back, you have Abraham as the same grandfather, Isaac, or great-grandfather. Isaac is the same grandfather. But the Jewish people came from Isaac's son Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and the Edomites came from Isaac's other son, Jacob's older twin brother, Esau. And if there's two things to know about Esau, number one, his nickname was Edom, which translated to the word red. And the second thing was Esau was a carnal kind of guy. He focused on the here and now. He didn't think about the future. You know, him and teenage me would have got along really, really well. Because, you know, me, I was always like, tomorrow wasn't promised, you get what you get it right now. And that philosophy, that was my kind of carelessness back in that day. So, but Esau actually traded his birthright for some soup. And I love me some soup, but I don't think I would have made a deal like that. But Edom, they still had some impulsive, rash decisions that stayed with them for the Edomite culture, because they decided to support Babylon when it was coming in to invade Jerusalem. And the cool thing about all this was God blessed the Edomites. And you can see that in Genesis chapter 36. There's a long line of descendants about the kingdom of Edom. And their blessing continued and their country thrived until the day they decided to betray Israel, their ancient relatives. And that was in Ezekiel 25:14, the judgment of them. God says, I will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and wrath, so they will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord. Yeah, and Edom declined greatly when Babylon took over the region. They weren't eliminated, though. Later on, the Jewish conquered them in 129 BC, and their land right now is actually non-existent, and their territory is part of modern-day Israel. So the fourth nation was Philistine, and they're not related to the Jewish people, but they've been a thorn in the side of the Jewish people from the very beginning with it. You'll see them over and over and over in the Bible, between the two nations warring in Joshua, the book of Judges, and King Saul and King David. King David's famous adversary, Goliath, he was a Philistine. God used Babylon as an instrument for judgment against the Jewish people, but he also used them against the Philistines as well. Ezekiel 25:15 through 16. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and their ancient hostilities sought to destroy Judah. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will wipe out their Carites and destroy those remaining along the coast. The Philistines, man, they just like to fight. Ever know anybody that like to fight? They like to fight, man. They like to rebel against Babylon, and they basically rebelled against that Babylon, and Babylon hit them back, because there's always a fight. So their population was deported, and most of their territory is also in modern-day Israel as well. Group 5 and 6, if you want to bring that up, they are, what's that?
What do you want?
The map? They are way, way, way up in the tippy top, the brown. And they're not really a country, but they're little territories called Tyre and Sidon. And they were little harbor cities, basically. And they were really important with trade. Tyre was really wealthy, and we're going to circle back to that a little bit later, but the Phoenician people were descendants of the Canaanites that worshiped the Canaanite god. Now, if you remember, if you read the Bible, when Moses took the promised land and Joshua, they were to conquer all the Canaanites and to eliminate them as a people. But they didn't. They didn't, and what happened was the Canaanite influence continued in the region, and it continued to pull the Jewish people more and more astray. If you ever heard of somebody named Jezebel, she was a queen from Sidon, one of these territories, that married into Jewish king Ahab and turned the people to worship the Canaanite god Baal. There's a huge showdown in 1 Kings between them and the prophet Elijah. But Tyre and Sidon were getting judged by God at the time because they were excited and they celebrated the destruction of the Jewish people. Jerusalem was a very important trade land through there on the land. But the two ones on the sea, they
Trade
wanted
route?
to. What's that?
Trade route?
Yeah, trade route. So, but the Tyre and Sidon, they were happy when there was turmoil going on in Jerusalem because their trade routes flourished. Little did they know that Nebuchadnezzar was going to turn his sights north to Sidon and Tyre and wipe them out too later. So, those were 6 of the nations. The last one was Egypt. And Egypt was a superpower at that time. And we still, they were a world superpower. And Egypt had a history with them, much like the Canaanite people. They had an influence with the Jewish people. In Exodus, we see the Jewish people leaving slavery and being led by Moses to the Promised Land. And when things got tough, they were often complaining that they had it much better back in Egypt with it. And the Jewish people left Egypt, but they didn't always quite leave Egypt. Part of Egypt always kind of stayed with them. They always kind of had that relationship with them. And when this war was breaking out, the Jewish king decided to rebel against Babylon and align himself with Egypt. Jerusalem was looking for Egypt to come bail them out, to help them out, to save them, to protect them. But instead, Egypt didn't show up, and Jerusalem was under siege. Ezekiel's oracle against Egypt begins with Israel's reliance on Egypt and Egypt's failure to provide that help. That's in Ezekiel 29, 6 through 9. Someone want to read?
And all who live in Egypt will know that I am the Lord. You have been a staff of reed for the people of Israel. When they grasped you with their hands, you splintered and you tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke and their backs were wrenched. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will bring a sword against you and kill both man and beast. Egypt will become a desolate wasteland. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Because you said, the Nile is mine, I made it.
But God was not destroying Egypt totally, at least, wiping them out like these other nations. In the second part of the oracle, he promised to restore Egypt, but Egypt wasn't going to be a superpower any longer. That way, they could never tempt Jerusalem again to become an ally. That's in Ezekiel 29, 13 through 16. It says, yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. At the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the nations where they were scattered. I'll bring them back from captivity, return them to Upper Egypt, the land of ancestry. They will be a lowly kingdom. They will be the lowliest kingdom and will never again exalt itself above other nations. I will make it so weak that it will never again rule over other nations. Egypt will no longer be a source of confidence for the people of Israel, but will be a reminder of their sin, turning to her for help. Then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord. So why are all these prophecies and these oracles of the nations around the Jewish people so important? Why did I take some time before you guys to death for your eyes to glaze over? Because they had to know who God was. They had to know God was in control. And the sin of the Israelites were not the only sins that were being judged. In other words, you could believe in God or not. These nations didn't. But in the end, you're still going to find out who God is and that God is real. And I feel like there's many nations and many people out there in the same boat as these 7 nations that we went over. These nations and people that glorify sin, they take advantage of people. They profit on somebody's loss like these nations, or even just are in open deceptiveness. These nations had an evil influence on the world. the picture is painted very well in Ezekiel, and he was describing the ruler of Tyre, that one wealthy little trade city. And the accumulation of stuff went to the head of the king of Tyre. He was prideful and even thought of himself as godlike. Listen to this prophecy from Ezekiel 28, 1 through 10. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, son of man, and say to the ruler of Tyre, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart you say, I am God. I sit on the throne of a God in the heart of the seas. But you are a mere mortal. You are not a God, though you think you are wise as a God. Are you wiser than Daniel? Is no secret hidden from you? By your wisdom and understanding you have gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasuries. By your great skill in trading you have increased your wealth, and because of your wealth you have a heart grown proud. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you think you are wise as a God, I'm going to bring foreigners against you, the most ruthless of the nations. They will draw their swords against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor. They will bring you down to the pit, and you will die a violent death in the heart of the seas. Will you then say, I am God, in the presence of those who kill you? You will be but a mortal, not a God, in the hands of those who slay you. You will die the death of the uncircumcised in the hands of foreigners." The king of Tyre, his arrogance, his pride, him setting himself up on the same pedestal as God. Does that sound like somebody to you? Sounds like Satan. Arrogance, pride, same level as God. There's a second part of this Ezekiel prophecy too. It says, "Son of man, take up the laminate covering concerning the king of Tyre and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You are in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. Carnelian, chrysolite, and emerald, topaz, onyx, and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, so I anointed you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways for the days you were created, till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence. You sinned, so I drove you from disgrace from the mount of God, and expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on the account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth and made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you. I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled by you. You have come to an horrible end, and will be no more." That's some poetry right there. That's a lament. That sounds to me like Satan getting swallowed by his pride and meeting his end. Now I got to be cautious because some people will try to say that maybe Satan himself or the Antichrist was running Tyre, and I don't believe that. But I believe the king of Tyre was deceived in his life, and he was following his pride, and he was acting exactly like Satan. And we get influenced every day. We choose to show the world Christ, or we choose to show the world the other guy. We can follow God, or we can push him away. Much like the Israelites in this war, and with Babylon, they could have listened to God and the prophets and repented. But instead, they listened to the voice in the nations around them that didn't have their best interests in mind. But it appealed to their pride. They said that you don't need to submit. You don't need to submit to God. You don't need to repent. You can defeat Babylon by yourself. Do you realize that there's a spiritual warfare out there? There's a spiritual warfare out there every day. It's fought for the most precious thing ever created. For your soul. For you. It's not against a war with people. It's against a war of the Spirit. Paul tells us in Ephesians 6:12. Someone want to read?
"For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rules, against the authorities, against the power of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm."
Later on in Ephesians, Paul talks about putting on the armor of God to protect ourselves in this battle. Because we need to be cautious out there. We need to be cautious of what's influencing us, what we're following, because that war is real and that goes on in front of our eyes every day. We need to be able to follow God. We need to hear his voice, because God will have victory, because we know God has that power. He has that authority over all creation. We talked earlier about Jesus walking in that authority on earth, over nature, death, disease, over demons. We know God showed the Israelites his power and authority countless times, especially during the exile. We know that God showed his authority over these 7 nations that didn't believe in him, didn't believe in his power and authority. And we know the Bible tells us that God has that power and authority over Satan too, because his forces lose. And at the end, God wins. But the question is, we know that God has that power and authority, but do we give it to him in our life? We talked about restoration last week, and part of that was recognizing what we needed to be restored from. All the warnings and all the things on the wall that can show us, what we need to do, and that we need to do it now. We need to do it now before it's too late. But after we recognize it, what we need to be restored from, we need to recognize God. We need to turn it over to him. We need to be able to say, thy will be done, not my will. That's hard to do. That's extremely hard to do. We get caught up in ourselves a lot. We get caught up, looking at our timelines, for it to happen right now, for it to happen our way. We get caught up in our pride. We get caught up like that king of Tyre, and we listen to the wrong influences in our life. We get caught up like the Israelites, and we listen to those 7 nations around us, instead of listening to God and the prophets that are right there telling us which way to turn. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that if you turn it over to God, it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows, because it's not. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to turn it over to God and let him do what he needs to do. We don't like to lose control. We don't like that word surrender. We're American. But it's in his hands. We need to put it in his hands, and we need to leave it in his hands. And sometimes that growth that we need to do to get to that other side is going to be very painful. For Israel, for those people to be restored, they had to have their cities burned to ashes, and they had to be exiled from it for 70 years. That's painful. They lost themselves, and it was a long, hard road for them to find themselves once again. But that was the path for them for restoration. Think about this. The path of the cross was a long, hard road as well, full of unfairness, full of brutality, beatings, lashes, blood, pain, and even death. But that was the path of restoration. That was the path Jesus walked for us, each and every one of us. Before Jesus took a step on that path, he turned it over to God. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prayed. Luke 22:42. He said, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. We're going to end tonight on this thought. If there's stuff that you need to be restored from, do you recognize it? And do you recognize who you need to give it to? Are you willing to lay it at the feet of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? Are you willing to give him that power and that authority over it in your life? Can you pray, God, thy will be done, not my will? Can you surrender it to him and leave it in his hands? And are you willing to walk that path, even if it's difficult, in faith? Because that's the path of redemption. That's the path of restoration. And there's only one way to get it, and that's to give it to him. You just have to give it to him, and you just have to let it. So next week, we're going to conclude this series. And instead of judgment and all this stuff, it's going to be nice. We're going to talk about restoration. We're going to talk about how God can bring new life to us. We're going to talk about being a new creation in Jesus. And we're going to talk about the infamous Valley of Dry Bones, bringing the dead to life. So,